Good afternoon. Welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater at the National Archives here in Washington, D.C., and a special welcome to those of you watching today on our YouTube channel. I'm Tom Nastic, Public Program Producer for the National Archives. Today, our series of noontime book lectures continues with Embassy to the Eastern Courts, America's Secret Pivot Toward Asia, 1832 to 37, with our special guest, Andrew Jampoler. Today is the last public program for 2015, so I'd like to take this opportunity to wish everyone here, as well as watching online, a happy and healthy holiday season, as well as thank you for your continued presence and support of our programs. We'll begin 2016 with a film program at noon on January 15th, in conjunction with a featured document exhibit commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Tuskegee Airmen. We'll screen two films from our motion picture holdings, Wings for This Man and The Negro Soldier. And then on Wednesday, January 20th at noon, author John Stauffer will be here to talk about his book, Picturing Frederick Douglass, an illustrated biography of the 19th century's most photographed American. To find out more about these and all of our public programs, please consult our monthly calendar of events in the theater lobby or visit us online at www.archives.gov. Andrew Jampoler is an alumnus of Columbia College and the School of International and Public Affairs, both of Columbia University in New York City, and of the U.S. State Department's Foreign Service Institute's School of Language Study. During more than 20 years on active duty with the United States Navy, he commanded a land-based maritime patrol aircraft squadron and a naval air station. Later, he was a senior sales and marketing executive in the international aerospace industry. He has been writing full-time for a dozen years. His previous books include ADAC, The Rescue of Alpha Foxtrot 586, The Last Lincoln Conspirator, John Surratt's Flight from the Gallows, and Congo, The Miserable Expeditions and Dreadful Death of Lieutenant Emery Taunt, USN. Following his talk and Q&A, he will be signing copies of his book, One Level Up, outside the Archives store. Please help me in welcoming Andrew Jampoler back to the National Archives.
Thanks very much. I always listen very attentively to those introductions. It's my last opportunity to figure out if I've come to the right place. And I recognize everything Tom said, so I'm happy to tell you that, yes, this is the right place. I'm going to be telling you a story, a true story. I guess I should say if this were a movie, there'd be a screen behind me that said, based on a true fact. And I've never known what other kind of facts there were. But in a moment, I'll be telling you a true story about America's secret first pivot to the Orient. And despite the fact that it was secret, feel free to tell everybody about it. You can. Before that, I owe you an explanation of why this was the first pivot. And if it's the first, were there others? And the answer is yes. In December and January 1941, 1942, the United States decided quite purposefully that they would first fight the war in Europe and then fight the war in the Pacific. And this was a conscious decision on the part of us and our allies. And finally, in May 1945, we pivoted towards Asia. The defeat of Germany accomplished. It was now time to turn the attention of the alliance, the United States specifically, the alliance towards Asia. So I would think that 1945 represents the second pivot towards Asia. There is a third, it's going on right now. The administration some time ago announced this pivot towards Asia, a reflection, I think, of the fact that China has changed its status, and the result of that change in status has changed our focus and our emphasis. The Chinese government junked Marxism, adopted capitalism, and suddenly they have an economic engine of such extraordinary power that it has forced our attention to the Pacific. But in fact, that hasn't happened either because of the tragedies in North Africa, the Middle East, and Southwest Asia. The pivot I'm going to tell you about in the 1830s really did happen. And let me begin first with a note about my sources, because I started out by telling you this is a true story. There are a lot of sources for this story. Many of them are here in the archives. This is the logbook of the United States sloop of war Peacock. It is the first page of her log when she's preparing to sail to the Orient. On the first of the two missions, I'll tell you, that logbook, that deck log, and all the others are here in the archives, very carefully tended to. The chief archivist for naval matters is a guy named Mark Milan, to whom I owe a great debt of gratitude. To whom I owe a great debt of gratitude for all his assistance. Anyway, one of my sources, right here in the archives, the logbooks of the ships concerned. Other sources are books written by contemporaries about these particular cruises. What I discovered in the course of my research is no Navy surgeon in the 19th century went to sea and then when he returned failed to write a book about it. It's absolutely extraordinary how regularly you can count on that fact. And the two sources I used for this particular story were a book called The Voyage of the Peacock, 2 volumes, by ship surgeon Benajah Ticknor. He's on the left there to you. And the second cruise was documented by the ship surgeon on that cruise, William Ruschenberger. Ruschenberger's tomb, he died in 1895. His gravestone is there. These two men wrote in great detail about the cruises. They wrote, obviously, about the medical conditions of the cruise and what they did about the terrible diseases that sailors were subject to, sailing to different places in a different time, in effectively the complete absence of workable medicine. There were very few things that could be diagnosed and very few things that could be cured. Benajah Ticknor, surprising me as you read his books, and he wrote a lot of them, he hated the Navy. He hated his service. He disliked his commanding officers, his fellow officers, the conditions under which he worked, the rules. As a matter of fact, he disliked sailing, period. And it's a mystery to me why he spent over 30 years as a ship surgeon. Very different guy, Ruschenberger, brilliant, hardworking surgeon, held sick call on occasion 3 times a day when he needed to, wrote volumes on the conditions that he saw at sea, and was much more at home and much more comfortable with the naval service until about 10 years after this cruise. He wrote a long essay complaining about the fact that line officers, officers eligible for command, treated him and his colleagues, paymasters, clerks, and other people like that, as underclassmen, as not true officers, not true naval officers. And he wrote a very good essay about how that should be changed. It took well into the 1890s for his recommendations, his referrals, to be absorbed by the United States Navy. They were all good ideas. Another source in private writing, one of the young midshipmen on board USS Enterprise, the Schooner Enterprise, wrote a 33,000-word document for his private use. This is that document. It begins by private journal of the cruise of the U.S. Schooner Enterprise, et cetera, et cetera. Henry Cadwallader is the guy who wrote this journal. These are some of his illustrations. Unfortunately, the ink he used devoured the paper, so some of those illustrations aren't particularly usable. Cadwallader was a young man, very impressionable. He liked life at sea. He didn't like his commanding officer, who he thought was a drunk. But those 33,000 words give you a very good sense of what it was like on a small sailing vessel during the course of the 2 or 3 years that you would spend going all the way to the Orient and back, or in the second cruise here, around the world at a breathtaking speed of average speed of about 6 knots. So you can get an idea how long it's going to take to go around the world. Okay, there are the sources. Here comes the story. At the conclusion of the American Revolution, astonishingly, the revolutionaries won, something that normally doesn't happen in revolutions. And beyond that, the leadership of the revolution was such that its principles and its purposes prevailed. And most revolutions that succeed end up in a bloodbath. Ours remarkably did not. And it's something that we should take credit for. This is the document, the Treaty of Paris, first page of it, September 3rd, 1783, that acknowledges the independence of the United States. These are the seals of the various signers, and this is a painting of those signers. You'll notice a distinct blank on the right-hand side, and that is because the British negotiators who signed the Treaty of Paris at the end of the war refused to pose for the painting. Kind of a last moment of spite. So they're not there. The reason this is important is almost immediately after the conclusion of the treaty, September 83, the Empress of China, a U.S. trading vessel, sails out of New England in February 1884 and heads for the Orient. She's carrying 60,000 pounds of Appalachian ginseng root in her hold, and she will sail to the Orient and trade for that ginseng, which was a precious commodity there, and pick up the preciosities, the goods of the Orient, bring them home and make a pile of money. And after this cruise, the first time a vessel under the flag of the new United States sails to the Orient, after the cruise, United States traders, largely New England people, ship owners, factors, people like that, start thinking about the Orient as a market. And they think about it very seriously for the next few dozen years because they have to. The conclusion of the American Revolution locks American flag vessels out of their traditional ports in the Caribbean and Europe. The British are brooding about that defeat, and they don't want to have competition from Americans now. And almost instantly, very soon thereafter, we end up with the War of 1812, and that will further close ports to the United States. So the ports of the Orient become exceedingly attractive and very, very interesting. And what compels that trade, what compels that interest, are the preciosities, the goods that the Orient has that Westerners, Americans, and Europeans want. And these are just what you'd think they are. Fabulous silks, product of the worms, beautiful ivory, carved into fantastic shapes and artistic treasures. And of course, down here, the porcelain, the fine porcelain tableware that is so appealing to Europeans and to Americans of some class. The second vessel to go to the Orient from the United States will return with a 302-piece porcelain service, dinner service, for President George Washington and his family. So this becomes the draw, the lure, and of course there's one other, and that is tea. For reasons that aren't completely clear, the drinking of tea becomes not simply something that you do for relief, for drinking, but it becomes a rite, a nourishment. The amount of tea that will be consumed by the United States and by Europe, British specifically, in the century immediately after the opening of the Strait is astonishing. This is a painting that hangs in the Peabody Essex Museum, and it's fascinating because it begins up here with the tea bushes being carefully cultivated and tended, and as you proceed down the hill through the various lines of people, you end up at the end with the tea picked, dried, packaged, sorted, priced, and boxed to be shipped to the marketplaces of the Western world. If you're interested in this, there's a really good book by the McFarlanes, mother and son, I think, called The Empire of Tea. I recommend it to you, but be careful because he's absolutely religious in his enthusiasm for the health effects of drinking tea. He is convinced that it is the single sole reason why humanity is alive today. But it's a really good book. There are a lot of books about tea. There are a lot of single product books, cod and salt and pencils and this kind of stuff, but this is a very good one. Okay, the problem with trading with the Orient was the Orientals, the Chinese, all they wanted was silver. And nobody wanted to expend the national treasure, silver, on trade with the Orient. So they needed to find a product that would flow the other way, an exchange. One of those exchanges was furs from the Pacific Northwest. One of those exchanges was sandalwood from Hawaii and those islands, and we would strip Hawaii of all the sandalwood that grew there for that reason. But finally, the product that seemed to be most successful in exchanging from the Chinese the goods that we, the West, so much wanted, turned out to be opium. This is a painting from 1831 of Western ships, a Brit and two Americans, at anchor on Lintin Island. I'll show you where that is in a moment. These are floating warehouses for smuggling opium into mainland China. This rowboat right here, they call them fast crabs, will take aboard the opium that's in from one or another of these warehouses and smuggle it up the river or along the coast as part of the trade. This was illegal. It was condemned by the Chinese, but it continued for decades. It was the product, it was the cause of several wars, and it was the basis on which China was eventually completely subdued, largely by the British, to Western influences. And this painting shows you how that trade was continued. The trade more generally is described really well in two books I'll just mention to you as we go on. One of them is Eric Dolan's brilliant When America First Met China. If you've read Dolan before, perhaps you read Leviathan. He's a good storyteller. This is a good story. Bernstein, Dr. Bernstein out in Oregon, wrote a splendid exchange on how trade shapes the world. That can give you a sense of the larger background of the story I'm going to tell. The revolution closes the Caribbean and some European ports to trade from the United States. The great Napoleonic Wars that begin after the sort of halftime rest in the Treaty of Amiens, they will close everything else effectively and make it enormously dangerous for American traders to operate on the high seas. This is just an illustration to remind me to tell you that those wars effectively began at the conclusion of the French Revolutionary Wars. They effectively began in 1803, and through 1815 they continued, and the economic warfare between continental France and insular Britain, the economic warfare that the two conducted during that period of a dozen years, effectively strangled American neutral trade, and it forced further the pressures on commerce and forced further our focus on the Orient. These are some cartoons of the period. One of the great sources of American exasperation with the British during the course of that war was the British tendency, the British determination to board American flag vessels, to interrogate the crews, and to remove from those crews forcibly anybody they determined on their own basis was a British citizen. The initial response of the United States was to put an embargo to prevent American ships from sailing. That was crazy. It was a self-inflicted wound. But these two pressures, again, heightened the focus on the Orient that came up. The War of 1812 in the United States, there's not a whole lot to say about it. On land, it was an enormous embarrassment. If we had found any less incompetent generals than we managed to find, today the Dominion of Canada would be a bunch of American states. But we managed to lose practically every engagement on land that we met. The difference at sea, well, the exception being the successful defense of Fort McHenry after the fall of Washington. There was a difference at sea. The infant United States Navy was enormously successful at sea, although it made no difference because it was very small numbers. The infant Navy, a dozen or so ships, was fighting a force that had over 600 fighting vessels in it. The beauty of this all was they were distracted by what was going on elsewhere in the world. So there were a couple of very successful frigate engagements that marked the War of 1812 at sea. The conclusion of that war was the Treaty of Ghent, December 24th, 1814. News traveled so slowly that despite the fact that the treaty was concluded, here is Columbia, the United States, and Britannia agreeing across some sort of classical plinth here, agreeing to restore their friendship. This is a cartoon that shows Columbia lecturing John Bull about her strength, her vigor, and providing new lessons. This in the middle is Bonaparte. Columbia explains to Bonaparte that when I get through instructing John Bull on the way that the world is going to be shaped from now on, I will turn my attention to France. Kind of frivolous, kind of silly, but it's a sense of the new spirit of the United States. If you're within 20 years of my age, you recognize this tune.
Along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. We took a little bacon and we took a little beans, and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming.
Feel free to dance.
There wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to running on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico.
That's enough of that. Andrew Jackson, about whom we'll have much more to say. Andrew Jackson is one of the great heroes of the War of 1812, one of the very few Americans who succeeded on land. It was his misfortune that the Battle of New Orleans, came about 2 weeks after the war was over. It had no particular effect. The Treaty of Ghent had already been negotiated and signed, but nobody over here knew that, not least of all not Andrew Jackson. And that tune and this painting shows you his heroic performance, and he will become, on the strength of his military successes and on the strength of his performance as a lawyer, as a member of the House of Representatives, as a senator, as a governor, all self-made, as a governor of Tennessee, he will become a major figure in the United States, the 1830s, right up until mid-century. There's a brilliant book about him, John Meacham. Most of you, when you think of Meacham's name now, you think of the new book about the first Bush that just came out. But this was his previous biography, and it's a very good one. Jackson's a fascinating figure. This is Andrew Jackson from the US $20 bill. And there is a lot of discussion right now about putting a woman on one or another of our pieces of paper currency. Astonishingly, the decision seems to be either to remove Alexander Hamilton, a schoolmate of mine, or not at the same time, we weren't classmates, or pair him up on the $10 bill with some woman. I would think that as long as there's hip-hop theater, musicals about Andrew Jackson, his popularity, about Alexander Hamilton, his popularity would be such that he can maintain his position on the 10, and we can get rid of this guy on the 20, who, after all, is one of his three principal activities as president, warred against the central bank of the United States. So he seems like a candidate. In any case, Jackson comes as a brilliant figure, largely self-made, an orphan, into the United States of the 1830s. And here's what the United States, this is Washington. In 1833, we're standing on Maryland, looking at the Navy Yard. This is the eastern branch of the Potomac. There's the main span of the Potomac right there. There is the Washington Navy Yard. Here is Washington, Capitol Hill, and all the rest of it. This is the United States in the 1830s. And I want you to think about that because remember that phrase about the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Our past is foreign, too. It's beautifully preserved in the archives, but you have to have a sense of how different it was to get a feeling for this cruise that I'm going to talk to you about. In 1830, New York is by a lot the largest urban center in the United States. There are about 200,000 people living in New York in 1830. That's a lot for the United States. It's pretty trivial as such things go in the rest of the world. Bombay, for example, in 1830 has about 50,000 more people living in it than does New York. The 11th city in size in the 1830 is Washington with a population of 18,000 or so. And number 90, the last urban area on the census of 1830, turns out to be Annapolis, Maryland, with all of 2,600 people. This is the world in which the cruise I'm describing to you takes place. Finally, the wars, the Napoleonic Wars end at the Battle of Waterloo, 1815. The world is at peace, and the United States looks around and tries to decide what to do and how to do it. The politics of the 1820s and the 1830s will be sharply shaped by the personal contest between these two men, John Quincy Adams out of New England and Andrew Jackson from the Tennessee frontier. Very, very different figures. The 1824 campaign is full of candidates for the presidency. This cartoon of the period will show you who they are. This is a Library of Congress cartoon. Adams, Crawford, Jackson, and Clay. The key, of course, will be Adams and Jackson. This is the way the vote turned out. In blue is Jackson. Adams is up here in New England in that odd pink color. And what happens is the election of this era goes into the House of Representatives. And in the House, John Quincy Adams turns out to be the victor in a deal that Andrew Jackson will believe was corrupted by promises made to Clay by Adams. In exchange for Clay's support, Adams agrees to make him the Secretary of State. And the common view in those days, and perhaps the view today, is the Secretary of State is a natural position to step up into the presidency. So in 1824, Adams wins on the strength of his deal with Clay. The next election, the 1828 election, will see Andrew Jackson win triumphantly, move into the White House as the president, and Jackson will be president for 2 terms. This is the infamous party, inauguration party, after Jackson was inaugurated as president. All his friends from the backwoods allegedly materialized in the White House, drank themselves into a stupor, and tore the place apart. And this is a cartoon that speaks to that. We now have Andrew Jackson as president. It is now 1832, and American trade, American vessels, all of New England is trying to figure out a way to make more money trading in this world. And along comes a guy, an unemployed businessman, sailor, and ship owner from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, who has 8 daughters whose wife has just died. He is desperately looking for a government job. He tries to be a consul in a variety of ports. All of these are turned down, and he comes up with an idea to regularize American trade with the empires of the Orient by negotiating treaties. So there he is, Edmund Roberts, unemployed, out of work, and very rapidly falling out of money. And he comes up with this idea. It's not his original idea. I'll tell you where he got it in a minute. And he approaches the Secretary of the Navy, Levi Woodbury, who also comes from New Hampshire. They have a very close personal connection. In some documents, there's a suggestion that they were kinsmen on some basis. And the Secretary of the Navy persuades the President and the Secretary of State to send a mission to the courts of the East, in the Arabian Sea and in the Pacific, to negotiate trade treaties to put U.S. trade on the same footing, they believe, as trade is conducted with Britain. So this group, with the decision of the President, decides to send a U.S. Navy vessel out carrying our negotiator to negotiate these agreements in the Orient. This is Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1833, a map of Portsmouth. There's the Portsmouth Navy Yard, and a stunning painting by a guy named Blunt of what it looked like in 1824. Again, the point being, this is a very different world than the world today, but the people were a lot like us. The first cruise that will take Edmund Roberts, the American negotiator, that was not in real time, incidentally. It took longer than that. The first cruise of USS Peacock, accompanied by USS Boxer. Peacock is a sloop of war with about a little more than a dozen guns. Boxer's smaller still. She's a schooner. This is that first cruise. They will be gone from home from March 1832 through May 1834, sail about 45,000 miles, and the effort is to negotiate treaties in this part of the world that will put American trade on the same economic basis that we believe British trade to be. The focus of this cruise is here in the Arabian Sea and here in the South China Sea, where these negotiations are supposed to be conducted. And Edmund Roberts will sail along this, spending 2+ years doing it in an effort to succeed in that. I told you that the idea for these negotiations wasn't entirely Roberts's, and it wasn't. The idea really came from the Sultan of Muscat, Sultan Said Said. His picture is here on the left, and there's some stamps commemorating him by the Sultanate of Oman today. Roberts goes out to Zanzibar in the late 1820s looking to sell some products from New Hampshire. He is frustrated. The cruise is completely unsuccessful, but by coincidence, sheer coincidence, he meets the Sultan of Oman, whose property Zanzibar was, and Said turns to Roberts and says, why do you Americans never come to this part of the world, negotiate the treaty with us that the British have, and succeed with trade on that basis? So the source of the expeditions that I'll describe to you now turns out to be what we call the Imam of Muscat, Sultan Said Said, and the treaty negotiated with him in this period will last through the Eisenhower administration and be amended, and it is in effect still today, which is a pretty remarkable document. So Roberts, with that good idea, sails down along the coast of South America, and will end up in Buenos Aires for a while. He ends up there because the United States uses U.S. Navy vessels to deliver our diplomats to foreign places. And the diplomat who is being delivered to Buenos Aires is Francis Bayleys from New England. He is the new consul. He is extraordinarily ineffective, and the guy he's negotiating with, the new chief of Argentina, De Rosas here, they don't get along at all. The result is, within 3 months of this guy being on the ground, he's back on another ship heading for home. Bayleys will spend more time sailing to and from his embassy than he will spend on the ground in Argentina, utterly unsuccessfully. But coincidentally, he will be there while the first, I think, of the fights over who owns the Falklands and what's to be done about them. This is 1830 now. This is, a century and more before Margaret Thatcher takes this issue on. Here are the Falklands down off the coast of Argentina, and the reason they fascinate Americans is because this is a sealing ground. Unlike whaling, which is done at sea, sealing is done on land. The Falklands have seals, And the Argentines have taken a number of American ships in sealing, jailed the crews, confiscated the ships and their prey, and this has become a great political issue, so the United States sends USS Lexington down there to shoot the place up. Lexington does that, and releases our jailed crews and others. This use of the Navy, single ship going to a foreign port, shooting the place up, you'll see again and again in the history of the 1830s. Peacock leaves from there, goes to Sumatra, to the pepper ports of Sumatra, and then will continue on into the South China Sea, where her mission will really begin. The reason she stops in Sumatra is her sailing orders require her to stop at a place called Kuala Batu in Sumatra. A year before, the Sumatrans captured an American trading vessel called the Friendship out of Baltimore. She was down there picking up pepper. They captured the vessel, killed a few members of the crew, took everything off the ship, and this act of piracy, Jackson decides, has got to be revenged, and he sends, he sends USS Potomac, there she is in two paintings by a brilliant British artist, to the Sumatran pepper port, and she shoots the place up as an example of don't mess with us. And Peacock is sent to make sure that Potomac's raid on Kuala Batu was effective, and it was. So Peacock will now continue with her negotiations. She passes through the Sunda Strait into the South China Sea, where these first negotiations will begin. And on the way into the Sunda Strait, right here, is a place called Angier Point, right there. This is a painting of Angier Point in the late 1800s. And the reason this is significant is because it is a source of fresh water. One of the limitations on sailing vessels at that time was just how much water they could carry and how quickly it became ropey with all kinds of growth inside of it, and how quickly you had to resupply yourself with water. Angier Point, it's a beautiful painting, is right here at the Sunda Strait, the strait that connects the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea and the Pacific, enormously strategic, which is why the Dutch, that's a Dutch flag, and here's another one, which is why the Dutch are holed out at Angier. Okay. USS Peacock sails through there. She stops in Milano for weeks, I cannot tell why, a resupply and other things, and then heads up to Canton, where her mission begins. An enormously important place because in that period, Canton was the vestibule for Western trade with China. This is a German map from that period. It is the Pearl River here heading up towards Canton. Over here is Macau on one side, Hong Kong on the other. This is the entrance for Western trade, which was not permitted any farther than to Canton. And right there is that island I showed you that had the opium ships anchored at it. So we are now proceeding, USS Peacock is now proceeding first in Macau to begin trying to trade with the Chinese. That will be unsuccessful, but the stop in Macau is fascinating. Macau was literally the entrance to trade with China. Here are two period paintings of it. This is a beautiful German map from that period, and you see right here is the Macau anchorage in the city, and there is the same anchorage right here laid out in front of you in two paintings. Roberts will go to Macau. The ship will stop there. He and the captain will proceed up to Canton on what amounts to a tourist visit. They have no authority to negotiate with the Chinese, and the Chinese have no interest in seeing them. This is what Canton looks like in the 1830s. This is the waterfront. Each of these buildings is a factory, called a factory, and you'll see this is the American factory here. These were the center points for trade with China through most of the early 19th century. These buildings / warehouses / residences and offices. The focal point of Western trade right there in these two. I don't know what that is. Oh, that's just blue sky. Okay. Nothing happens in Canton. They all recreate themselves. There are no negotiations, but they proceed now to the first of the negotiations in Vietnam, in Cochin, China, where they will meet with the emperor of Cochin, China. They will try to meet with him. They never see him. A guy named Ming Mang. This is Ming Mang as he looked in a book of that period. And they try to negotiate a trade agreement, and Ming Mang and his mandarins will have nothing to do with them. USS Peacock remains at anchor for more than a week, for several weeks as a matter of fact, trying to get past the low-level mandarins who greet them at the anchorage, and nothing happens. Roberts is completely unsuccessful in this mission, and he proceeds from China to Siam, to Bangkok, where he hopes there that he will be successful. His negotiations will be with King Rama III of Siam. This is Rama III in statue and painting. Really tough guy, understands the West, who has negotiated with the British, and who is willing to listen to what the Americans have to say. And they will finally succeed in negotiating the first of the trade agreements that Roberts was sent to. We don't know, or Americans for the most part, don't know much about Rama III, who was the half-brother to the King Rama IV that we know very well. I put this in here so I can pause while I'm talking. This is the overture to The King and I. The king in this question is Rama III's half-brother, Rama IV, who should have been king were he not usurped. The story we have of this, let's stop that. The story we have of Rama IV comes from Anna Leon Owens, who was his housekeeper and ran his school. She was kind of a mysterious half-Indian, half-British character. She wrote a book about her experience. That book becomes Anna and the King of Siam. Anna and the King of Siam becomes the Broadway musical, The King and I. And a guy who looks like this is transformed into a guy who looks like that. And Anna Leon Owens ends up being a Deborah Kerr, not nearly as badly dressed as Yul Brynner is. In any case, the negotiations in Siam are completely successful. The parties proceed on to Mocha for a stop that seems to have no purpose at all, and then to Muscat in Oman, where they will succeed very quickly in negotiating that agreement that I told you about was lasting up until the Eisenhower administration. So this is that route across the water. They pass through Singapore. Here's what Singapore looks like at the time. Recall that in 1824, Singapore becomes a British possession as part of a deal with the Dutch. And this is the city of Singapore, all of it. This is a street map of Singapore in the 1820s. They arrive in Muscat to begin the negotiation with the treaty with the Sultan. And this is an 1826 painting by a British officer in the Indian Navy, a guy named Mackenzie, of what Muscat looks like as they arrive. If you've read Lawrence of Arabia's book about his experiences, there's a phrase in there talking about the heat coming out of Muscat like a sword out of the desert. USS Peacock arrives here, they hang at anchor, and they begin the negotiations of a treaty that will be enormously successful. Back to South America, Roberts boards USS Lexington. He heads home. All he's been able to do is negotiate a treaty with Siam, with Thailand, and what will become Thailand, and with Muscat, the Sultan of Muscat. And he returns home at the end of this, delivers these treaties in Washington. They go through a ratification process. Roberts works very hard to get appointed as an ambassador to go back and deliver the ratified treaties and to negotiate some more, including what he hopes will be the final and the jewel in his crown, a treaty with Japan, a place that so far only the Dutch have been allowed access to. So there's a second cruise, April 25th, 1835 to November 2nd, 1837. By the end of this cruise, USS Peacock will have been gone for 5.5 years. She will have sailed for more than 100,000 miles, I told you, at the blistering speed of 6 knots. And the whole purpose of this will have been to establish these treaties and to carry Edmund Roberts around to do that. This time she doesn't leave Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She leaves Charleston, the U.S. Navy Yard in Boston, Charlestown, excuse me. Here's what that Navy Yard looks like in the 1830s. There's the rope walk where they make the lines. Very small operation, a single dry dock, a couple of ship houses, and there it is. They leave from here and head out for what will be a 2-year-plus cruise. There is the first leg of it. They're going to return to Muscat with the treaties in hand, ratified treaties in hand, and exchange them with the Sultan. That is successful, although there is a long delay. Roberts, this is the text of that treaty, incidentally, as it looks today in English. Roberts will have a really exciting moment in his life on the way to Muscat to do this, because his ship will run aground at night at full speed on the island, a shoal off the island of Masura. Peacock will run aground, almost tear her bottom out. Desperate moments. Roberts, a midshipman, and 6 crew members will take one of the small wooden boats and go around to Muscat to report the catastrophe. The Sultan will rescue them. Peacock will continue on, leaking furiously until she gets to Bombay, weeks later, where she'll go into dry dock for repairs. Very nearly lost the ship there at that moment. Here's Bombay in 1833, the next stop that Peacock has. And her stop there is simply to use the very well-developed shipyard here. This is the fort of Bombay on the island. Recall now, we're at about 19 degrees north on the western side of India, and these islands have not yet, what is today Bombay, those islands have not yet been land-filled and connected up with each other. So this particular island is still standing alone and separate, and there is the fort of Bombay, and here's where Peacock will be overhauled. She then proceeds, after the repairs, down to Colombo for fresh water. And departing Bombay, the crew gets, about a quarter of the crew gets sick, desperately sick. And this is a very common feature of U.S. ship visits to Asia or to any distant place. All the diseases that are local, our sailors have none of the immunities, natural immunities for, and don't know anything about that kind of stuff anyway. And from now on, about a quarter of the crew of USS Peacock will be more or less seriously ill, and they'll start throwing bodies over the side as people die. The logbook entries are very unemotional. In the middle of a logbook entry talking about winds, weather, and sailing conditions, there'll be a line saying, sailor such and such departed this life, period. And then they go on to talk about other things. And what that means is his body went into the water. At Colombo, they will rest, recuperate a little bit from the stop in Bombay, and resupply themselves completely with water, because the feeling is the water in Bombay was contaminated. They're certain that the water in Thailand is contaminated. Their next stop up here at the head of the Gulf of Siam, where they will deliver the ratified treaties to the King of Siam. This is what that treaty looks like. I mentioned to you earlier how important the archives was in recording our national life. Here is that treaty in length. It's in 4 languages. Thai, Siamese, and English are 2 of them. Portuguese and Chinese are the others. It's 9 feet long, signed and sealed by the officers of the Siamese court, and it is resident here in the National Archives. This is a photograph of the signature page of that. And here it is in English, the most magnificent king in the city of such and such. And it goes on in very flowery language. By the time they leave Siam, the crew is seriously ill, and for that matter, so is Roberts, the negotiator and not ambassador, but playing that role. And they will proceed south through the Gulf of Siam and around to their next stop in the face of conditions that the surgeon now, Reschenberger now describes as a hospital ship. He has stretchers laid out across the deck with the diseased sailors swinging in the stretchers, sick call 3 times a day, 40 and 50 people daily being treated by the surgeon, whose medical kit, as a practical matter, cannot manage the diseases, either dysentery, diphtheria, or cholera, that they will experience as they sail. This is a medical map. I mention this only because 1830s were the first time that cholera came out of its natural reservoir area near Calcutta, spread through the West, got all the way to the United States, through Canada and other ports. And this is a map, a medical map, of the spread of that first global epidemic of cholera. Roberts will try again to negotiate a treaty with the Vietnamese, the Cochin Chinese. Again, it will be completely unsuccessful. There will be no mutual conversations. But what makes this significant is Roberts now is fatally ill. He doesn't know that, but he will soon die. And he dies as the ship arrives in Macau for the 2nd time. And at that point, the diplomatic aspect of Peacock's cruise is over, because despite the fact that the officer on board, Kennedy, who was the senior Navy officer on this small squadron, asked the State Department for permission to substitute for Roberts in the event something happened to him. The State Department declined. So beginning now at Macau, with Roberts dead and buried in Macau, all that USS Peacock and her escort have to do is to return home. The Protestant graveyard in Macau, remember in the 1830s this was Portuguese and Catholic. The Protestant graveyard in Macau was open for only a few years. It's very small. There are about 160 graves in it. A third of them are Americans, incidentally, which will give you an idea of the tremendous influence and the role that American trade played in the China service during the early years of the 19th century. This is Roberts's grave right here in the Protestant graveyard, the old graveyard at Macau. It was raised as a gift by the American citizens of the community there. This is a memorial window in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in the Episcopal Church in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And here is St. Edmund, a memorial to Roberts, and to his wife, who had died long before this, St. Catherine. It is the gift of one of his granddaughters, who also provided all of Roberts's papers to the Library of Congress, which obviously was another source in the story I'm telling you. What is left now for USS Peacock to do is to simply go home. And this is the route. She will complete circumnavigating the globe. This is the route she takes out of Macau, across the Pacific, across the broad Pacific, down the coast of South America during a time when Chile and Peru were fighting each other, so there's a long delay right here, and then back around and heading for home. Roberts is dead. His treaties have been ratified and delivered. All that's left is the story of USS Peacock. USS Peacock becomes one of the several vessels of an absolutely extraordinary scientific expedition the United States sends out for 4 years, 1838, 1842, under the command of a very difficult young man named Charles Wilkes. This expedition is designed to map and chart large areas of the Pacific, to explore islands and atolls, to return with all kinds of specimens, so many specimens that Wilkes' collection forms the basis of the Smithsonian Museum's collections. It plays an enormously important part during the 4 years that this expedition goes out, not simply across the Pacific, but everywhere, conducting surveys, doing mapping and things of that sort. As part of that expedition, they are mapping the Pacific Northwest, and here is the mouth of the Columbia River on the ocean. Right here is the bar at the entrance to the mouth of that river. USS Peacock will be destroyed on the bar. She will be, let me go back, because I want to talk to you about Nathan Philp. This is a superb book, Sea of Glory. It's about the expedition of the U.S. exploring expedition. I commend it to your attention. Philbrick is a great storyteller anyway. In any case, USS Peacock sails up to assist in charting and mapping the Pacific Northwest, an enormously important area because we think the British are interested too, and we want to put down, we meaning the United States, want to put down our marker there. Peacock will cross the bar to the Columbia River. She will not succeed in crossing the bar. She'll be caught up on it and destroyed, happily with the loss of no lives. They will be rescued by Peacock's small boats. This is an illustration in 1841 of that rescue. There are the boats, and there's Peacock coming apart. But that is the true end of the story. She will die in 1841, having performed really some extraordinary missions, not the least of which are the two that carried Edmund Roberts on his embassy to the Eastern courts, for which attention I thank you. Roberts obviously never made it to Japan. That happens 20 years later. This is an absolutely marvelous Japanese woodcut showing one of Perry's ships opening Japan, guns firing, steam and smoke everywhere, a crew leaping through the rigging like apes. Roberts had a State Department permission to negotiate with the Japanese. The plan was that he would go there. The plan was that he would deliver 10 merino sheep to the Emperor of Japan because people believed the Japanese really wanted sheep, and Dutch sheep somehow hadn't met the Japanese standard, and we were going to slide past the Dutch by delivering 8 ewes and 2 rams of merino sheep. That never happened. First, the rams and ewes never got loaded aboard. Second, obviously, Roberts never made it up there, but he wouldn't have succeeded in any case. What's significant about this, what impressed the Japanese, what made that opening successful, was the enormous power that Perry brought into port. The guns, the ships, 4 the first time, 10 the second time. Roberts was under instructions by the State Department to hire a small civilian merchant ship and to approach the Japanese in this small unarmed vessel, and that would have made no impression at all on the shogun or the Mikado at all. This is what it took to be successful there, and it happens 20 years after Roberts dies. I've told you a story about the book that has just come out, Embassy to the Eastern Courts. I have been writing full time for 15, almost 18 years now. These are the other books I've done. Adak, the true story of the ditching of a Navy aircraft off Kamchatka at the height of the Cold War in 1978. The Last Lincoln Conspirator, John Surratt's flight from arrest and trial. Surratt makes it all the way to Alexandria, Egypt, before he's captured, returned by the Navy to trial, and quite remarkably excused, and lives until 1916. He will die surrounded by his family. His wife is a cousin of the guy who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. Black Rock and Blue Water, the true story of the wreck of the Royal Mail ship Rhone down in the British West Indies. A lot of people dive on that wreck today. It's only down about 60 feet or so. Sailors in the Holy Land, the odd American expedition in 1848 to measure the elevation of the Dead Sea, and in the mind of the commander of that expedition, to prove the literal truth of the book of Genesis. They succeeded in measuring the elevation of the Dead Sea. It was then about 1,360 feet below sea level. I leave it to you to decide if anybody has proved the literal truth of the book of Genesis. Horrible shipwreck, 1833, the true story of the female convict transport Amphitrite, taking women convicts from England to Australia. She made it a week out of port, was wrecked in a horrific storm in the Channel with the loss of all the women, their children, and all but 3 of the crew. And where does that leave us? Oh, Congo. This is the story, the remarkable story of the United States and the Congo at the end of the 19th century. We were, to our everlasting shame, the first country to diplomatically recognize Leopold's colony of the Congo. Subsequent to our recognition, all the rest of them came and trained. We then sent a young naval officer, Emery Taunt, 3 times up the river. The last time he died there. Taunt was a man whose feet of clay extended all the way up to his hips. He had a very serious drinking problem, among other things. But he was our first resident diplomat in the Congo to write that book. My son and I spent about 3 weeks, a little over 3 weeks, I think, riding the Congo River in a small boat. That's the bow of our boat. The stern was not far behind it. And just an amazing expedition. What it proved to me is the Congo River today is very much like it was in 1890s. Okay, the book I've been talking to you about, Embassy to the Eastern Courts, is at the gift shop upstairs. I'd be happy to sign some copies for you. I would urge you, despite the fact that it says it's a secret mission, I would urge you to tell all your friends and relatives, because I think I make the magnificent sum of about $1.50 on each copy that's sold. It is adequate, I told my wife, to keep a family of tropical fish in great comfort. Happily, we don't have to do that. Any questions, any comments? I thank you for your attendance. I thank you for your patience. I'd be happy to respond to questions. There are microphones in the side, but it occurs to me that your voices surely are loud enough to carry in this select company of, what are we, 25, 30 perhaps? Any questions, any comments? Please. We don't know.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. The question is, what did Roberts die of? The answer is, I don't know, and neither did Ruschenberger. Ruschenberger conducted quite bravely an autopsy on everybody who died aboard his ship, which is, to my mind, a lunatic thing to do in an age where you cannot manage disease and you really don't know what you're looking at. The guess is no, probably diphtheria or something like that. But cholera was epidemic in that area at that time, and the ship had gotten cholera, and it had, in the previous cruise, the first cruise, had about 11 people die. They caught it in Manila. The idea was that cholera was caused either by exerting yourself in high temperatures or eating too much fruit, or smelling the air that passed over rotting vegetables and rotting fish. I mean, all kinds of wild ideas. It would be some years later that Dr. Snow figured out, what was it, the Broad Street pump in Soho, England, and London, that cholera was waterborne, and figured out more or less what was going on. Back in this time, nobody had any idea what was killing them. And the medicines they had, of the medicines they carried, about the only thing that was any good at all was, you guessed it, opium. That worked on a number of things. But opium, we look at it differently than they did. Opium was a common product in children's, not ointments, in children's tonics. When kids were colicky, they would be served a tonic that had opium in it. Sure enough, it calmed them down at some expense, I think, to their health. Yes, sir?
So I get what you're saying. You use the word pivot. Talk about this 5-year period, these two expeditions, right? And then you mentioned when you thought there were other pivots.
Uh-huh.
But in between that time, we had John Hayes' role in terms of keeping China, the open door policy in China. We had Teddy Roosevelt sending the
Sure.
around the world.
Sure.
And then, what we did in the Philippines, et cetera, et cetera. Why aren't those pivots as well?
They could be. I'll explain the word pivot a couple of ways. One of them is our focus. What? Oh, the question is, why isn't all the history in between this time and the Second World War, all the emphasis of the kinds of things we were doing in China and the Pacific, why aren't those pivots too? And I cowardly said, yeah, they could be. What happened here in this instance was the American trade focus was exclusively in the Caribbean and to some extent in Europe and Africa, only because of the connection with the slave trade. The idea that there was something to be done and money to be made in the Orient was a new idea. And the first time it was pursued aggressively, very aggressively, on a diplomatic and government-to-government level was this one. Clearly, we have been a Pacific power throughout our history. And very quickly after the continent was tamed, so to speak, we pushed out into the Pacific, and we're constantly a presence in China and other places. To our shame, in the Philippines as a result of the Spanish-American War. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
You showed the map of the spread of cholera through the world.
Yeah.
Was the Peacock responsible for
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, it certainly moved some cholera patients from Manila to Canton, to Macau. And when she arrived in Macau, she still paused to bury the last of her cholera patients who died there. When she invited the American community in Macau on board for Sunday services, they didn't come because they understood that the ship had cholera on board. They came the next day, however, for reasons I can't describe. I don't think she was. There was movement, enormous movement back and forth of trading vessels, vessels in the country trade, that is to say, those who worked in the Pacific only and didn't even get to Europe or other places. And cholera expanded through all of that, moving, as everything else did in the 1830s, by ship. People, merchandise, products, ideas, and disease. Any other questions? You've been a splendid audience. Each one of you is precious to me. Thank you for coming. And I hope if I fail to educate you, that's my failing. If I fail to entertain you, you're just tough. Okay, rush on up to that bookstore and make me a rich man, okay?
Yeah, it's one level up in front of the museum store is where the book signing will be.
okay.
One level up.
That beautiful cover that you have is a painting by a guy named Daniel.